Welcome to Brain in the Vat. We are delighted to be joined by Tara Smith, and we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial philosophers around, not Stephen Kirshner, but Ayn Rand. Tara, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
It's not exactly a thought experiment so much as pointing us to the way most people think of egoism. So Ayn Rand, open, explicit advocate of being rationally selfish, but going after your self-interest. Now, most of us are taught this is the antithesis of what it is to be a good person, of what it is to be moral. And I think our images of self-interest are actually pretty unrealistic. So for instance, if you think about the regular parade of creeps across the cultural landscape, which we're all familiar with. Creeps is a mild way of putting it, but when you've got Bankman Fried or Bernie Madoff engaging in fraud, or a Harvey Weinstein really taking advantage of women sexually and so on. And, there's just the cast of characters changes, but we all know these guys. The normal reaction of people is, oh, how selfish, you know, and similarly, there are people who are inconsiderate and just, in our personal interactions, we dismiss as selfish bastards, something like that. But if you actually think about what some of these people's lives are like, I don't think most of us would agree that, oh, yeah, they have a great life. They've really done a good job of serving their well being, serving their interest. But, the only damn thing is they got caught in some of these cases. And man, if they didn't get caught, Bankman Fried, yeah, that's the life. All right. I mean, another way to think about this is think about when you go to the wedding or you go to the college commencement. And typically, normal case, you wish those young people all the happiness in the world. What is it that you're actually wishing for, though? Like a life of fraud and deceit and just getting away with what you feel like when you feel it. No, that's so. I guess an opening suggestion would be simply I think we need to think afresh about what a good life for a human being is and base our understandings of self-interest and the pursuit of self-interest is coming from that rather than just accepting these, I think, somewhat lazy uh, images sometimes and assumptions about what is actually selfish.
I really like this question. What is in your self-interest? So, do you think that what's in your self-interest depends on what your preferences are, or can it be objectively specified and understood? So, Bankman-Fried and Weinstein, you could say, even if it was in their self-interest to live a life of fraud or sexual exploitation, um, that actually wasn't in their self-interest, because objectively, that's not what's good for a person. That's not what's in their self's interest, even if they believed it was. So, are you holding sort of an objective view on what makes someone live a good life?
I think that self-interest is at once objective and dependent on, to some extent, on a person's own tastes or preferences or inclinations. And this is important in Rand's view. She's very firm in distinguishing what she calls objective, even in regard to value, from the intrinsic. I think there's often an idea inherited from a lot of philosophers and religious views that there are certain things that just are valuable for people, or certain ways of acting that simply are right. There is this Platonic form or this God given command, and that's the objective, as opposed to the subjective based on the person, whatever he wants, whatever he thinks. So while she doesn't endorse, and I wouldn't either, the subjectivist view, it's not objective as it's just given and it's for us to find out. Rather, what's going to be objectively good for Jason does depend in some important ways on the fact that he enjoys this kind of work or this kind of career or this kind of relationship or recreational activity and so on. Now, where there's room for preference or desire, or, we could be more careful about some of those terms, but where there's room for this individuality, it's bounded. That is, it's not, well, whatever you want, as long as you're able to get that, you're serving your objective interest. There are certain things that are in the interest of human beings by virtue of being human rather than by virtue of being Tara, who has this particular taste, and, Mark, who has this particular interest in another sense. So objective, but not as a mutually exclusive alternative with related to and based in part on the interests, the tastes, what is satisfying for you, what is pleasurable for you.
So I want to try and dig a bit deeper into this. It seems vital to work out what the theory asks of us. So if you're told the right thing to do is that which is in your self-interest, then we need to know what it is. So you can imagine the person who says, well, I have this strong subjective interest to hurt other people. I just find nothing more delightful in life than to kidnap people, put them in my basement, and I've got a whole farm of little kids out there. You might know my best friend who's in Austria. He got caught. I haven't been caught. And I just love it. It's just the best. And the more suffering I inflict on them, the better. And that's my subjective preference. And you go, oh, hold on a second. To be a good human being, there's some ideal out there of what that is. And that's going to, reference virtues, and you should be kind and wise and, beautiful, or whatever else, whatever virtues you want. And I say, okay, well, which one is it? Do I look at my subjective preferences, the things that actually make me happy? Because when I spend my time going around being kind and considerate, it just fills me with despair. I really hate it, and I'm just miserable. That doesn't seem like I'm, satisfying my self-interest when I go and do those things. It seems like I'm satisfying your interest when I go and do those things. So which theory is it? Are we looking at objective goods, subjective goods? Do you discard some? Is there some other side constraint that's playing?
Okay. So something like a side constraint, right? Because I referred to there are bounds around what role your personal inclinations or enjoyments can play, okay? But not side constraints in the sense that those, I think, are sometimes used in theories to represent somewhat arbitrary, okay, but these are the rules. Like, these are the rules. We've all got the moral rules, the moral givens. And within these rules, then, you can indulge these preferences, but not those, because those are beyond the rules. Rather, in Rand's view, based on, in fact, based on the nature of the beast, based on the nature of human beings, there are certain kinds, broad kinds, but kinds of activities that we need to engage in because they are beneficial for human life, for human survival, including psychological health, because we are psychological beings as well as just physical material beings and so on. And a life of indulgence in doing what you feel like doing because you feel like doing it, whether it's abusing small children or whatever it might be. Again, that criterion or that filter for your guidance, doing whatever you feel like doing just because that's not a recipe for success for human beings, right? We have to respect, we have certain needs for long-range thought so as to be able to fulfill our needs. Claws and fangs don't do it for human beings in the way they might do it for some other species and so on. So the point is, there's a natural, literally nature-based kind of boundary set of the kinds of then enjoyments that it can be okay to pursue. So for instance, within productive work, an important value for Rand. Doesn't mean we all have to have the same careers, right? I mean, you want to be an attorney, you want to be a science fiction writer, you want to be a kindergarten teacher, you want to whatever. Within certain, right, you want to be a child molester. Well, we'd need to think of, is that the kind of activity? Again, there are different layers on which you could analyze this, but everything's got to be consistent with the general kinds that are conducive to human flourishing. So it isn't, I mean, just to put this in the perspective of other moral theories, historically, it's a naturalistic theory. It's one somewhat similar to that of Aristotle, or more recently, a Philip of Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, some of these people, what's his name? Richard Kraut, sort of naturalistic accounts of value and what's good, and then the derivative virtue.
It's quite hard to specify what naturally humans need to do in order to flourish, though. And it's interesting that you reference Aristotle and virtue ethics, because that's a famous problem for Aristotle. So, the question was raised for virtue ethicists, well, what are the virtues? And the classic answer given is the virtues are the things that the virtuous person would do. The virtues are the ways in which the virtuous person would live. But you ask, okay, so how would the virtuous person live? And you say, well, they'd live in these virtuous ways. And what are the virtuous ways? Well, So it's circular. And I wonder whether bringing nature into it solves any of that circularity. Does it solve the problem? Or is this just the same problem dressed up in a different way?
I don't think Rand's answer is circular. It may not be fully satisfying to some, or it may need more further elaboration in terms of specifying. But in some of her early essays on virtue and value in general, like she asks these questions, like, why be moral? Why have this whole category of morality? Why distinguish the good and the bad, the virtuous and the vicious, and so on? And the reason why we need these distinctions, and she does mean literally need them, comes from, again, our nature, not from looking at these are the properly revered people in our society. So I think you're probably right that in Aristotle and in some other accounts of virtues, we get these unsatisfying, well, that's what the good people do. Her approach is to try to figure out what are at the most basic level, long range needs that human beings have to fulfill, such as, well, yeah, we need to be rational because you might get away with an irrational action in a given case, but that's not a policy for success, right? We need to engage in productive work. Sure, you can take a vacation like I'm going to do in a week or two, right? Sure, you don't need to be working every hour of every day, but we need to generate the kinds of goods, services, spiritual values, artworks, and all that can sustain us. We need a certain quotient of self-esteem, of self-respect to motivate us to enjoy our lives and so on. So it's going to try to identify things that actually are in the, in the interest of human beings. And if you could think back to the opening example and what you wish for these, again, going to this model, assuming benevolence at the wedding and so on, or the graduate, when you wish them all the happiness in the world, you don't think, whatever you want in this, whatever kind of creep or cretin you are, right? If your desire is to do absolutely anything, we just hope that you get it. No, we normally have some idea that there are certain ways of being that would be more conducive to your really enjoying the kind of life form that's possible for a human being. And you realize there are variations in there. One's son and daughter-in-law might not want to live in the state of Iowa, or where you might like to, they might like a very different kind of life, but within certain boundaries, you think there are ways of succeeding and ways of failing. And I think that's what needs to inform our understanding of self-interest and the pursuit of it.
So a couple of thoughts. The one is that it may very well be the case that human beings as a class, there are things that will help them flourish. Okay. And you can go and identify, finding meaningful work, devoting yourself to certain kinds of pleasures. You might say this is generally the guidance that we have from the history of humanity, that humans flourish in this way. And so if you want to lead a flourishing life, this is what's good for you to do. But again, we're going to have people who deny that. They say, well, that might be very good for you, but that's not what's good for me. And, if the idea is that this is an individualistic account, then I want to choose a life that's different. And what you're doing is something rather totalitarian by telling me how I ought to live through your sense of, human standards of what is good for other people. Lots of things that are good for other people that I don't really like. Jason and I, for example, can't really stomach watching sport. I would think most human beings absolutely love it. That spending a Sunday evening with a couple of beers watching American football is the best thing that they could do. And they'll say, I flourish, and this is my thing I look forward to every week. And I say, it is the most nausea-inducing activity for me to watch people kick a ball around a pitch. I have no desire for it whatsoever. But no, it's really good for you, Mark. You should do it. And I'm going to deny that very strongly. So there are going to be certain individuals who just really do want different things. So that's the part one. Here's part two. What moral claim is there to say that I ought to lead a life that's good for me? That just seems like a different kind of claim. That seems like a kind of contingent claim. If you want to have a good time, you should do the stuff that other people do, but what makes that moral? Why ought I to do it in any moral sense? You might say, if you want to have fun, do these things. Like, so if you like Chinese food, go to this restaurant, they make the best Chinese food, but it's not moral.
Right. Let me start with the second. she doesn't think of the moral as not conditional on what you want in a really important way. She has an essay in which she makes very clear that everything you ought to do is conditional on something else that you want. And in the end, it's the only thing you got to do is die. But if you want to live, if you want to flourish, so there is an if at the real basis of her whole theory. So it's not that, again, we have this inherited set of what is good, or the moral is something other than I wouldn't say contingent exactly, but yes, the condition. No, morality is conditional. But if you want the kind of life possible to a human being, then you need to tune in. Then you need to pay attention to the kinds of actions that are going to be more conducive and less conducive to your ability to get that. So that's what the whole model is like for her. Coming back, I'm sorry for you if you're not an American football fan, but completely accept that. I mean, I will totalitarian. Look, there's a big difference between saying there are things that are good for people and I'm going to force you to obey and to comply, right? So nothing in what I'm talking about, even in defending the objectivity of value, says, and it is for me or fans of Ayn Rand or any government or anybody to force you to comply. The only thing I think we're entitled to force you to do is leave people alone such that they can pursue whatever they want to do on Sunday night, sports related, arts related, goofing off, like whatever it might be. So there's a major so the totalitarian thing is, whoa, to say that there's objective value. I mean, there's objective value in freedom, in Rand's view, in letting people figure out the good life for them. And this in a way comes back to independence, which she sees as a real important virtue, people's thinking for themselves, and which allows the possibility of making mistakes, right? But the way to correct mistakes is through more thinking, through more talking with other people, through listening to what they have to say, the benefit of their experience or wisdom, and sorting out who's full of garbage and who's full of wisdom and so on.
So I'm curious what flourishing looks like to Rand. So far we've objected and you've defended the view that flourishing is what we should do, and that flourishing is what's moral. But what does flourishing actually look like to Rand? If you get it all right, so if you act always within those boundaries of what a human being should do.
Yeah. So it can take on many, many different flavors and compositions. But, so one place to start is simply with the observation. Self-interest, right? She says you should pursue your own self-interest. Self-interest is an abstraction. And in effect, you're asking or you're flourishing. I should pursue a flourishing life for myself. Yes, I should. And I do. What does that look like? Well, for me, actually, it'll be too boring if I just tell you about me. But I mean, for people I know who basically they're flourishing, right? Well, he's got, his career is going well. His career as a programmer, as a algebra teacher, the career is going well. He's advancing at a nice rate, but that's satisfying to him. He works with people he enjoys working with. It's the right level of challenge. It's not over and so on. His kids are doing well. They've just started in the new school and they're worried about the adjustment, but no, they seem to be thriving and adapting well to the new environment. He's got his cholesterol under control after the doctor had been so worried about it. What I'm trying to get at really is that many of us pursue self-interest in whatever we think, whatever we tell ourselves about our moral views and the propriety of altruism as opposed to egoism or what have you. Most halfway competent people who we know and interact with every day pursue their self-interest in lots of ways, pretty innocuous, don't seem threatening to other people, but they're pursuing taking a nice vacation or maybe moving to a little bit better neighborhood because of all the crime lately in the, in the apartment complex they've been in and so on. They've got hobbies, they've got interests, be it in the sports realm, or he loves opera, or, he loves this kind of gaming, or he loves rock climbing, or he loves keeping bees. Self-interest is values interest. And I think a good flourishing life is one in which a person has a set of values that he's really thought about such that they do fulfill different thirsts that he has. in ways that are mutually compatible. I mean, obviously, you could put together a bad mix. And it's like, well, that's really taking away from this relationship that I want to develop with this woman. So, I mean, we're not all experts. We're we're fallible about our own interests as much as we can make mistakes about, how best to care for my child or how best to do this or that other thing. So there's no guarantee that you're going to be all right from the get-go about what your self-interest is. But a lot of, here again, I think one of the interesting things about Rand is you've got to form a self and a self-interest by a lot of reflection and on an ongoing basis, because the kind of work that might have been really satisfying 5 years ago, you're finding, gee, it's not as much fun in the classroom anymore, or it's not as gratifying to me to do this and so on. So it's putting together the kind of ensemble of specific values and pursuits, relationships, and so on that can be fulfilling in a sustainable way.
So you touched on something earlier, which is the idea that we should have mutually compatible freedoms. So you talked about your own life. There should be some kind of harmony between the things that you're doing. But the other one is in relation to other people, so that they should be free to lead these lives of their choosing that are in line with what's actually good for human flourishing, and so should you, which implies a non-interference. So what happens if, in order for me to flourish, I need to take something from you or to interfere with your freedom? Is that wrong on the theory? Is it wrong for me to interfere with other people's freedoms in order to help myself flourish?
Yes, because I think it's not really going to help you flourish. That is, we need to fit, on a up close and, right here, it might look like, oh, this will be in my interest, to take that from Mark or something. But I think on a more considered reflection of, again, the kinds of actions that are most conducive to um, human beings flourishing, it's going to be respect for other. You are most valuable to me as a rational thinker. I mean, that all the upside of value, all the potential value in this other person or that other person to me. So again, selfish value, right? But to just be a good friend or to come up with wonderful products and services or anything in between, right? The source of your potential value and human beings' value to one another is their minds, their rationality, their ability to think, which requires their freedom. I'm undercutting the possibility of that when I infringe on their freedom by, for instance, taking their property and so on. So again, in part, I'm just pointing to you know, many of these threads individually can be talked about at great length, but it's looking for that strand of connection, such that we're not just judging on a case by case basis, on the short sighted kind of myopic. Ooh, that looks good what he's got, and I want it. That doesn't mean it's actually in your interest.
Well, doesn't it depend on what game I'm involved in? So if I betray Jason, that seems like it's bad for me. We've got a long-standing friendship. We produce the show together. The short-term benefit that I get is going to ultimately backfire quite badly. But let's say I'm on an overseas holiday and I see a very wealthy guy passed out on the side of the road, and I look at him and I see he's got a nice Philippe Patek watch. And I say, we'd be able to do some really incredible stuff on Brand Nevada if I just took his watch. And he's passed out. We don't have a relationship. Um, I've undermined his interests, sure. But when I sell that watch on the open market, I'm going to be able to increase rationality, not just between Jason and I, but we're going to be able to do all sorts of dazzling things with our guests. Our lives are going to flourish, as will our guests. We're going to be maximizing the good. Yeah, the poor rich guy, man, he's got other Philippe Patek watches. Doesn't seem, you've already got a stretch on an empirical claim to say, oh, I've done something bad for myself here.
Okay, I do think you've done something bad for yourself there. I don't think you can just glibly assume, we're going to flourish. We have this, now we have this extra money. This is great. The fact that you may have no further relationship with the guy who you took advantage of, right, doesn't mean that you have treated him in the way that it makes sense for you to generally treat human beings, because that's the path to successful living. Now you've set up a situation in which, to hell with principles, to hell with any general policies of how to treat people on a case by case basis. I'm going to try and figure, is this going to be a plus for me? I don't think it's the case that human beings can actually succeed on that sort of piecemeal thinking. We need to elevate to a higher tier of thing. And I mean, higher, just more abstract tier, okay, not morally inherently superior, but a more abstract level of thinking about human relations, such that, yeah, it might be tempting in a given case. Man, I could get that watch. I could get away with it. It's worth a lot and so on. But it's not the type of action that's going to be sustainable. Moreover, if, and to the extent, and this is an if, but if you think, I do have some principles and I do think it appropriate for my own self-interest to be living by those principles, when you cheat on them, you're giving yourself a bad message and you're weakening yourself for future cheating in a way that's also not going to be in your actual interest. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, I guess, behind what's most visible and conspicuous. And I think realistically, it's easy to see what I'm talking about. I don't think it's nearly as easy to see that it's in your interest in the kind of scenario that you were talking about either.
What is interesting is that you've started by giving a position that most people would disagree with from one perspective, and it's landed up being a position that's pendulumed all the way to the other side, where people will provide the opposite objection. So initially, people are going to say, well, I think it's wrong to be selfish because you're going to do bad things to people. And you say, well, no, 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 no. That's not real selfishness. Real selfishness involves living according to certain abstract principles, which would imply that you're going to do pretty good things to people, or at least refrain from doing very bad things to people, generally. And then someone's going to say, but hold on, now it seems like you're overly restricting what could be good. So there could be instances where violating these abstract principles seems intuitively to not just be in my self-interest, but to be the moral thing to do. So an example is, you're sitting in World War II, you're harboring Jews. The Nazi officer comes around and he says, where's Anne Frank? And you say, well, if I comply with the abstract principle that Tara wants me to comply with, that Rand wants me to comply with, it's I shouldn't generally lie to people. And I shouldn't think on a case-by-case basis about whether I should lie in this case or that case. So I'm just going to tell the Nazi officer where Anne Frank is. So it seems like this case-by-case basis is going to be very important. Now, of course, your rejoinder could be, well, there's a higher principle here than the telling the truth principle. It's that I shouldn't endanger people's lives. But now you're facing problems that a lot of deontologists face, which is, well, when you've got conflicting principles, what do you do? And it seems like the only way that you can answer that question is through a case-by-case discussion. And specifically, what you're gonna land up doing is you're gonna look at the utility involved. You're gonna say, well, in this case, it will have higher utility in the long run for everyone involved if I were to lie about where Anne Frank is than if I were to tell the truth. So in this case, I'm going to take the principle of protecting life to be more important than the principle of telling the truth. But in another case, I might not, depending on the life and depending on the truth involved. And I think that ultimately what's going to happen, and I'm saying this as a utilitarian, is all of this boils down to utility. So I think this whole discussion, ultimately, when you're looking at difficult cases, you're always going to be looking at the utility involved. And that's what's going to be your decision maker in these difficult cases. So I think that the rubrics used, like virtue as a rubric for how to live, ultimately doesn't give you anything more than utility.
Here's a commonality, right, that I'll grant you between utilitarianism, at least of some sorts, some species of it, and Rand's view. The whole point of morality is practical. It is to serve our happiness. She cares about, like her moral theory, you bet it cares about the ends. Remember where, one of the things I mentioned a few minutes ago. If you want to live, if you want to enjoy a flourishing life, there's no obligation to be moral and so, right? But if you want to live, then you need to tune in and pay attention to, okay. So absolutely, the whole point and payoff is human flourishing. Okay, now, unlike, of course, traditional utilitarianism, it's not about the social good as opposed to the individual good and exactly what is the use. Coming back then, very interestingly, to, the Nazis, you're hiding the Jews and the Nazis, and do you tell the truth and so on. So having said, I think in response to something that Mark was talking about a few minutes ago, it's not conducive to human flourishing to try to go about figuring out what to do on a case-by-case basis. That doesn't mean, in Rand's view, that does not entail you don't pay attention to cases. You don't pay any attention to particulars. You do. Principles are your basic guidance, and you try to figure out the principles that are most applicable to most of the kinds of cases that people normally encounter. But occasionally, there is the extraordinary case. A fire breaks out in the next room, right? I mean, again, occasionally, the rare exception is there's something extraordinary going on. And the principles to get human beings through normal life, they would not work in those circumstances. They are not appropriate there. So one of the things that she does talk about is how the application of principles to particular cases, and we live in particular cases, right? That's always got to be thoughtful and sensitive to context. Not in a way such that, well, now it's just case by case, no guidance from principles. You just kind of make it up from scratch each time where you investigate. No, we need to identify the through lines. This is the way to heat our houses. This is the way to feed my daughter, or whatever it might be. You need to figure out the through lines. But yes, be sensitive to certain circumstances that are so extraordinary that adherence to the principle of honesty, let's say, come back to the Nazi case, right? Since that is a principle that is premised on and intended to serve human life and well-being, when clearly your adherence to being honest or telling the truth in that case would be used against you and human life and the life of this person. And she actually talks about this kind of case. She thinks you would not be obligated in a case like that. So it is context sensitive without surrendering the principles to case by case by case by case by case.
So here's my worry, is that some theories are like jello. So you poke them and you pod them and they just move in whichever direction you want, and they'll always generate the right result. So this theory sounds like it's virtue ethics. It might cease to become a theory and not be action guiding. So when I want to know what the serious moral theories, they give you some guidance. So the utilitarian is going to say, all right, well, work out which is going to maximize the good. And maybe we can have a whole bunch of rules, which we generally think maximize the good. If you're a rule utilitarian, we've got some evidence to suggest they do. And once the evidence shifts, we change the rule. If you're a virtue ethicist, you sort of say, well, you do the mean between the two vices. So you be wise and you be kind and you be just and those things. And the deontologist says, well, you obey the rules and, forget about the utility. That's not a consideration for us. You don't violate people's rights. So one account is that you're saying it's all of those things, because all those things are useful in human life. And whichever outcome makes you feel the most comfortable, I'm just going to say it's that one. So I'll rely sometimes on rules, sometimes on utility, sometimes on virtue. And I'm just going to tell you that all of this is what's good for human beings. And, I'm always going to get the right result. But the difficulty is, of course, when you get these clash cases. So when we're trying to weigh up values, when we're unsure, often the...
So it's not that there are cases in which, no, we should violate the theory or we should violate the principles. The principles from the get-go need to be understood as principles or generalizations to be applied. And in the vast number of cases, if you figured out good, valid principles, then yes, in the overwhelming, like 99 point something percent of cases, those are the things to go by. But it is not an exception to the acceptance of that to understand that principles always have to be applied in context, and you need to pay attention to the context to make sure that's the appropriate principle to apply here. So you're not violating those principles, I think, when you respect the contextual nature of the guidance that a principle purports to give. And I don't think in any of the cases that we've talked about, I've implied that it's the benefit of other people that, in effect, trumps my pursuit of my self-interest. Rather, what I have appealed to a few times in different terms and in different language is the fact that ethics is based on, and the basic instructions of an ethical view, in her view, the basic identification of what things are good and bad, valuable or not, what kinds of actions are virtuous and appropriate and moral or not. That is based on the nature of human beings, not just on the nature of me or me as a woman or me in this society or that society. So that's why we'll sometimes come back to it's not conducive to human flourishing, right? but it's not so much to sacrifice or cheat on the selfishness of this. And I should say, Jason, you said something about being bad to other people is one thing. Going out of your way to do something good for other people is a different thing. So this came up kind of in passing in something that you said, but there's an important difference between my refraining from interfering with the freedom, let's say, of other people and my taking it on as an obligation, as many, 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 many people think they should, to elevate the interests of others before that, right? And that is definitely so. It's not like, oh, this Rand, this is nothing, or you can. It's very bloody different from when we go to those commencements again, and we hear you are to serve others, you are now to give back, right? You are now. What was it Michelle Obama used to say? Service is the rent we pay for living, right? You have to do your part. You have to be a part of something grander than yourself. And so, I mean, so there's like, we can't pretend that there's not, to put it mildly, strong altruism out there in the culture. And she is definitely disagreeing with that. Now, what she doesn't think is that human relationships are zero sum, such that we needn't, it's not that, well, in pursuing Tara's interests, that's going to leave you on the side of the road. If we really have a good understand, when people are rational and have a good understand, and they're living their lives in constructive ways. So again, these are some ifs or whens, right? But when certain conditions are met of being rational and so on, there's just an abundance of win-win relationship possibilities out there. So I think that also maybe colors some of the inferences that we start drawing about the implications of what she's saying.
Quite a lot of Rand's view, as you've given it to us, seems to ride on this notion that humans are a token of a species. So Jason is a token of a species, Tara's a token of a species, and that species is human beings, and human beings have these constraints, these side constraints around what it would mean for that species to flourish. I wonder, and this would be violating something Rand said that we shouldn't violate. We're not allowed to give outlandish thought experiments, but I wonder whether different species would have different boundaries. And for example, if Martians arrived tomorrow and those Martians just had a very different psychological makeup to us, those Martians thought about the world in a very different way, gained pleasure and happiness and a feeling of warmth and love in very different ways. Maybe they gained those feelings from just utter annihilation and destruction of other species. Would those Martians be morally obligated to do so, to destroy Earthlings? Now, the reason I'm asking this question is not just because it presents one objection, but because many people think that certain humans belong in at least some way to a different psychological species. So we think that, for example, sociopaths are just so differently wired to the rest of us that what would make them happy and flourish is just so different to other human beings. I think if you were to commit to what Rand is saying fully, you would have to agree that the Martians are obligated to wipe out and annihilate other species if it brings them a deep sense of joy and a deep sense of fulfillment in their lives. And if that's the case, why isn't it the case that for sociopaths that should also be true? It seems like it must. It seems like it follows.
First, I would want to know more about these Martians and whether or not they even need ethics or morality, right? I mean, because again, so yes, different species, just as a matter of observational fact, without talking about morality at all, right? Different species thrive on different sorts of things, have different kinds of needs physically, in terms of their diets, their exercise, or what they need to do to fulfill their needs. And so yeah, different species, different needs. So hers is very much a need-based account of moral value when it comes to human beings, because, important fact about us, unlike the amoeba, choice. We can choose, right? I can choose to get on the Zoom call now or not, go to the gym and exercise or not. Like, we're making all of these conscious choices. Now, obviously, one can talk about lower life forms and so on, but it's a need-based account of values and the kinds of discrimination that human beings should make in selecting this is a good for, this is a value, and this is a bad for, this is a disvalue. Okay. So then when it comes to things like, when we're imagining being, beyond the beings, all the other species that are already out there, now if we're going to imagine Martians, and nothing wrong with that, okay, but I would want to know, do they even need to make the kinds of distinctions that we're talking about when we're talking about morality? And I think I'm open to the idea. I mean, I'd want to think a little bit more about this, but yeah, where you've got fundamentally different needs for the genuine well-being of beings of that kind, the Martian kind, the lion kind, okay, then yeah, I think it would be a different set of goods and bads. Where does this leave our poor psychopath? That's harder to say. Damn it, yeah, that's hard. But I think you're going to have a hell of a lot of continuity with using the standard of health for a human being, right? And it can't just be, well, he gets his jollies from doing these perverse things, at least by the lights of most of us.
Maybe the objection then is it's incorrect to think about human beings as homogenous. So it's a false description of what's happening. So to think that all human beings have enough in common that they form a natural kind in the sense that they have the same needs, that might just be false because some human beings are so different. The sociopath, it seems, has very different needs. Like he just wouldn't derive any joy and fulfillment from the kind of kumbayaness that non-sociopaths seem to derive joy and fulfillment from. He wouldn't derive joy and fulfillment from close, intimate connections in the way that someone who's not a sociopath or a psychopath would. Another example that's less extreme but more common is autistic people. So autistic people just live in a very different world in their heads. They have a very different perspective on the world. Now, I'm not comparing autistic people to sociopaths. I'm not saying that they have needs that involve the harm of others, but they seem to have needs that are very different. For example, a lot of autistic people have the need for structure in a way that some non-autistic people might, but it does seem like their needs would be quite different in certain ways. And it just seems wrong to think that human beings as a whole all have such similar overlapping needs that we could we could specify what human beings' needs are as a whole.
I think we need to be very slow and cautious with that. That is, if we think there is such a thing as being sick, right? I mean, sometimes you go to the doctor and it's like, no, you've got this disease, or you've got this, you've got a cold, or you've got the flu, but you're not well. You're right now a defective specimen, so to speak. I'm not at my best because I'm suffering from this, whatever. Okay. If there is such a thing as being sick, as being a deviant, at least temporarily from the norm, I think we have to be really careful about realizing that is going to extend to certain cases where, man, it sure feels to them like they're taking good care of themselves, or they're just as well as they can be when they're getting their jollies from this kind of thing, be it harming other people or being at a certain structure in their lives and so on, right? Yeah, okay. Certain order, that kind of thing in their lives. Just lost the train of thought there. I guess it would go back to trying to identify the depth of level of need and how those needs could be satisfied by someone operating regularly on, I don't know if you want to call them the premises of the sociopath or the premises of the autistic person. That is, much as it might sate certain appetites for certain people to do this or do that all the time, is that going to be the kind of activity that can actually sustain human beings? So I think we still have to go to the model of the overwhelming number of cases which are similar, in which we can through which we figure out in the same way that we do to a great extent just for health, for physical health, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of analogies to be drawn there. Obviously, they get much trickier when psychological things come in, but I think it's a good model for thinking about health and propriety.
I'm glad you brought up health, because we think that there are some things that are good advice, given that people have a certain biology in them, and that's you can give that advice to almost everybody, and it's going to be good advice. And then there's going to be some things where we say, well, given the particular conditions that you have, we really ought not to give you the general advice. It's going to be counterproductive for you to do this. If you're a diabetic, we're going to really take that into account quite seriously when we give you a treatment. And so there are going to be a whole bunch of health cases where we say we definitely don't pretend that there's some abstract treatment norm that we're just going to shove down your throat regardless, because that's what's good for 98% of people. We take into account your particularity and we say, qua diabetic, this is the best thing for you. And we don't take into account at all what the other people, what their situation would be. We know that it would be a very bad idea to give the diabetic the treatment that we would give to everyone else. We customize accordingly. So I think Jason's point holds, which is that you've either got to say, to hell with the psychopath. It is bad for them to be denied all the pleasures that would actually make their lives go better. And I don't care. I care about humanity. I don't care about their self-interest. You bite that bullet. Or you pretend, well, no, the psychopath just really hasn't come to grips with it yet. And if we just give them more of the same medicine, it'll work. Just like with the diabetic, we just keep giving them this treatment and, we lose a bunch of diabetics. But, I promise you I'm right. And so you make a strange empirical claim. Or you bite the bullet and you say, the psychopath really likes to do some pretty dastardly things, and that is what's good for them. And that is what they ought to do based on the theory.
That seems to be using the standard, or using as the standard what the person likes. And that's not the standard in Rand's view of how you determine what's good or bad. While she does think that doing the kinds of things that are most conducive to survival will overall be enjoyable things, it's not the enjoyability of it, or, this presses my buttons in a pleasing way that makes certain things good or bad.
Well, no, I don't think this is just about pleasure. I think it's about what's in that particular person's interest. So for the psychopath, for example, they might say, look, forming family bonds fills me with nothing but dread. I really hate it. Trying to say that I should have this remedy that's one way to make my life flourish is just terrible advice. Really. We can even have the non-violent psychopath, who's not going around killing people and placing their lives in danger, whatever it is. But there's going to be certain things that we would ordinarily recommend to human beings that this will make you flourish. And if you gave that advice to the psychopath, you'd be giving them bad advice. They would not be leading a flourishing life. And it's not just about their enjoyment. It seems to say, well, if we care about the things that would make you better off, some of those things that work for other people aren't going to work for you, like with the diabetic. I'm interested in something else, though, which is at a political level. What does Rand think about how society ought to be structured? What are the kinds of rules that we ought to have in place that would be good for human flourishing?
A great deal of respect for individuals' freedom. That is, at least when people reach a certain age of maturity, of ability to reason, and so on. Voluntary associations among people, such that I trade with you, I speak with you, if I want to and you want to, but if we don't, others leave us alone to go our own ways, right? Rather than, for instance, the government saying, well, if you're going to hire this guy, you have to pay him this wage, or you have to offer him these terms, and so on. So she's very much, an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism. She's not an anarchist. She definitely thinks we need a government to protect individual rights, individuals' title to freedom, but the government should be an extreme. So government, in her view, is not a necessary evil, as I think some, at least, libertarians think of it. It's a necessary good to do a minimal but absolutely crucial job of protecting individuals' freedom from force, from a certain kind of interference that other people have the potential to raise. Yeah.
I'm curious why her view doesn't collapse into or doesn't imply a more a stronger state with stronger regulations around people. Why is it the case that the state can't get too involved in your life? If we're so certain about what makes people's lives flourish in general as human beings, why can't the state push harder and say, well, you might have preferences not to perform certain sports-like activities, but you know what? It's good for humans as a whole. to enjoy sports. So we're going to force everyone to play a sport.
So let me put it this way. The fact that we might know,
So
you and me and Mark, doesn't mean other people's lives are ours. So a big theme in Rand that I haven't mentioned, important idea. Each person is an end in himself. Simple to say, really profound. Like, each person is an end in himself. His life is his to do with what he wants, as long as he doesn't forcibly interfere with the freedom of others. Now, we might want to preach and proselytize and try to convince people of their own will to live the good utilitarian life or Rand objectivist egoistic life or whatever, right? But if we can't convince them of their own, that doesn't give us, however smart and enlightened we might be, the right to say, to hell with you, we're just going to commandeer your lives and make you do this, drink your medicine because it's good for you. Even if we're right that it would be better for them. So it's very anti-paternalistic because that's not actually going to help anybody to flourish. And here we come back to, again, this independence, which is a whole thing, we haven't talked about today, another time. You've got to think your own thoughts, reach your own conclusions for them to actually be valuable to you, for your life to be valuable to you. If I follow the script that you give me, even if it's a really smart script, I'm not going to be flourishing, right? What's the Orwell line? Teaching a parrot new words. I mean, that's more in the context of free speech, but teaching a parrot new words doesn't really accomplish anything. And giving me the script to live isn't going to lead me to a flourishing life.
So we can imagine, as you say, not leading a life of your own choosing at all, versus being steered in a direction that makes you lead a flourishing life that becomes of your own choosing. And so if the thing that you really care about is the human flourishing, and we accept that freedom is really important for human flourishing, but you also think that there's a whole range of other values that are important, why make freedom a trump? So if I say, look, I'm going to erode your freedom a little bit, and we do this with children, right? We force children to do all sorts of things they don't want to do because we think it's good for their flourishing. And then eventually they become good, flourishing people. And so you can imagine the state taking a view, look, making a bunch of bad choices, we're going to steer in the right direction. And then at some point, once we can see that you've got wings, we're going to let you fly and you can make your free choices. Why not take that view?
So I think we do that with children because they're children. Because they're children and they don't yet have enough information and experience and capacity to make their own judgments, which includes making their own mistakes, right? But freedom is I forget if you use the word Trump, or why does freedom have such a position of strength in all of this? Because she sees it as the precondition for reaching sound conclusions about any issue, including what is actually going to be a flourishing life for you. That it's only free thought that is not in effect, coerced at the point of a gun. I mean, in effect at the point of a gun, but coerced or forced, that enables me to consider alternatives, to think them through, to reach rational conclusions. I'll reach irrational conclusions sometimes. Sometimes I'll have to correct what I thought, 2 months, 5 years later, I'll see, wow, that was a really mistaken conclusion that I came to, and so on. But it's only freedom that will allow us to to recognize what makes the most sense and then to put it into practice. Yes.
I have a feeling that you've snuck in or smuggled altruism into your view of selfishness. And here's the root that I think here's how it's happening. So you're saying the selfish thing to do is the right thing to do, and the selfish thing to do is what's good for you as a human being, as a token of the species. What is it for something to be good for a human being? Well, it's the kind of thing that we intuitively think is good for human beings to flourish, for a token of a human being to flourish. Just it's a general token. It's an instance of the species. Now, if you talk to evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists, they'll say to you, well, what's good for a token of the species is to perpetuate the species as a whole. So it sounds like if you were to take scientists seriously, psychologists, evolutionary psychologists, and biologists seriously, what you're saying ultimately is that really what's good for a person is to do what's good for the whole. And then it just sounds like, well, you've collapsed into utilitarianism. But even if you put that problem aside, it seems like what you've landed up with at the end of all these steps is exactly the opposite of the initial appeal of Rand's theory. So the initial appeal was that, well, this theory claims something incredibly bold. It claims that what's good for you as a person is to do what's in your self-interest selfishly. What we've landed up with is the entirely opposite theory, which is that what's
Yeah.
good for you is to do what's good for your species as a whole.
Here's, I think, the misunderstanding in what you say. No. I should do what's good for me. The only reason I care about the species, or the role that the species and my references to the species has played in everything I've said, is to understand what's good for me. The good of the species, I'm not going to, in a certain sense, I don't care, or that's not the primary for me. But insofar as, like it or not, I'm a member of this kind, things of this kind have these needs. If I want to persist as a member of this, if I want to persist, if I want to take good care of myself, if I want to be happy, if I want to enjoy my years, however many they are, then for that reason, I need to pay attention to, hey, is there anything that's not just distinctive to Tara, but to, well, Tara's a this or a that, or then I need to pay attention to those things. So I don't think that I'm in any way elevating the good of the species over the good of the end. No, it's you should be selfish. Yeah. For your own benefit.
So the question is, why do humans have the needs that they have? Why do they have them? You're saying, well, those needs pop into existence for no reason whatsoever. Evolutionary psychologist or biologist says, no, they have a reason, and that is they've evolved that way.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't say, oh, evolution is right. Of course, there's a level of explanation of why we have the needs and the capacities that we do that evolution has been terrific in educating us about. But that addresses, I think, a different question than the question that morality is traditionally concerned with. How should I lead my life? And that's what her egoism is trying to answer.
Well, for any other theory, there would be distinct questions with distinct answers. But in your case, you've collapsed the two. So for a utilitarian, they'd say, well, what are the needs of human beings as a whole? Those could be very different from what makes a particular person happy or unhappy. Because what makes Mark happy isn't necessarily the same thing as what makes another human being happy. So the utilitarian will pay close attention to that. But the Randian, on your understanding of Randianism, is collapsing the two. The Randian is saying what makes this individual person happy is what makes a random token or a prototypical token of the species happy. And what makes the species happy, the evolutionary psychologist and biologist will say, is what perpetuates the reproduction of that species and the survival of that species and the success of that species.
So a couple of things. I think part of what's going to make a Mark or a Tara or a Jason happy, part of it is going to be explained by the kinds of things that will make anybody, any token of the species happy, right? But the explanation that, the further layer of explanation that you referred to that the evolutionary biologists will give us, doesn't tell the individual what he needs to know in order to figure out how to lead his life. I mean, what is true of the species at the level of biological development, capacities over tremendous expanses of time is different from is a different kind of issue from the kinds of choices that confront us in the 70, 80, 90 X years that human beings typically have these days, and don't help. But that level of explanation isn't really helpful for explaining the kinds of things that we need to heed in figuring out what we should do. Just as when we go to the doctor, it's like, okay, you can tell me an evolutionary story. I want to know what medicine I should take or what I should stop or start doing. And
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you to some extent if you're looking purely at biology, but that ignores psychological evolutionary theory. So let's just take an example. One of the ingredients you've mentioned as being important for a flourishing life is living a successful career, is having a career that advances you in the world, that's successful, that challenges you, that you're able to make progress in. Now, an evolutionary psychologist would say, well, that's entirely explicable. Why? Because women want to find a husband to have their to impregnate her that will be able to take care of her children. In order to do that, he needs to have a successful financial setup. He needs to be able to provide for those children in the long term. How would he do that? Well, through a successful career. So the evolutionary psychologist would say, oh yeah, we totally agree that we totally understand why a flourishing human being and why it would be a need for human beings to have a successful career. It's because that's what perpetuates the species. That's what allows that man to have a child that would flourish, that would survive and do well in the world. Um, but
Some,
then it seems like what you've done is sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say, I guess I'm not clear on what that really helps us understand. Of course, we've all heard these explanations and read them, and there's a lot. Yeah, there's something right about them, even. But it doesn't, I think it doesn't address the level of question about how to use your choices to craft the kind of life that's going to be a flourishing life for you. So I guess I'm still feeling like there's a disconnect between the levels of
Well,
discourse and what they explain or address.
I think the implication is that if you agree with evolutionary psychology and you agree with Randian theory, then the conclusion is you should do whatever perpetuates the survival and flourishing of the species.
My position is not then human beings should do what human beings should do, or something like, or like what it is good for you. Human beings don't have to do, shouldn't do a blessed thing unless they think, yeah, I like this. I like getting up in the morning. I like my days. I'd rather be alive than dead. I have a lot of fun being alive, whatever that trials and tribulations might be. And so, right, like this is, yeah, I like it. I want it. Okay, if you do, but there's no standing obligation to the species or to my mother or to anybody else, or to Ayn Rand to live. But if you personally think, yeah, this is a deal I'll take, then make the deal by paying attention, being rational, paying attention to the needs that are going to be dictated in large part by the kind of being you are, by the kind of species to which you belong.
Well, Tara, it's been wonderful having you on the show. And as a viewer, we can tell you that the only way to lead a rational life is to listen to more Brain Navat and to tell us what you think about the show in the comments section and to send us a voice note on Spotify.